Hello YouTube. I want to talk about the concept of rights today because I think there's a gross misconception as to what exactly rights mean in today's society. We have a lot of sort of spoiled brats running loose, throwing temper tantrums, demanding rights which they sort of concocted out of their rear end. And we know these aren't rights, or rather they're sort of synthetic rights because they're how they're derived. They're socially fabricated. They're not based on like universal principles or self-evident truths or anything like that. They're just kind of made up as they go along. A good example of this would be so-called abortion rights, which, before 1973 they didn't exist. The Supreme Court just sort of interpreted them into existence and then, based on a consensus, voted that they're rights. Now, if they're actually rights, they would actually have existed before 1973. But, they just came into appearance suddenly at 1973 and then they continued onwards. So now, how we can tell the difference between a real right and a synthetic right is that a real or natural right exists before a society comes into existence. Another example would be healthcare here. Healthcare rights are rights to, free health insurance. Now, people have a right to life, and from that we can possibly, advocate taking some taxpayer money to help people out when they have, life-threatening, like serious problems that they can't pay for in any other way. But that doesn't mean they have, carte blanche rights when it comes to free liposuctions, free hip replacements, and the whole 9 yards like that. And for this healthcare rights, they're not actually natural rights because they require taxpayers and a government and a healthcare apparatus to create those rights. Now, if they were natural rights, they'd be based on natural law, which would be inherent. Like the Declaration says, humans are, all men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. Now, them being inalienable means that they're sort of intrinsic to the person, right? They're not dependent on society or anything like that. They just exist by themselves. So, if a human being, there was no society, just human beings running around in the wilderness, they would still have those rights, even though there's no society. And so, with healthcare, we can tell that healthcare is not a right because it needs a society to create it, and whereas their real rights are just intrinsic things that are connected with them because of who and what they are. And so now, what really ticks me off is how these rights these synthetic rights get sort of conjured into existence. And you can see this with so-called rights to higher education, or education rights regarding college. People just come up with this terminology, education rights, and then they create a sort of lexicon around that to justify education rights. And if they can sort of dupe enough people into believing that there is such a thing as education rights, then all of a sudden the new consensus is that there is education rights, and then all of a sudden those rights sort of just get conjured into existence. And now with this, you can take this anywhere. It's kind of I can, for example, make car insurance rights, cell phone bill rights, or no, free cell phone rights, air travel rights, and if I can create a framework and convince enough people that the framework is right, or trick them with the terminology I create, I can just sort of pull those rights out of hats and make them come into existence out of thin air, basically. And throwing a nice political temper tantrum and causing a lot of ruckus kind of goes a long way to convincing people as well, because you constantly keep stirring the pot with it and bring it up, and eventually you ingrain it in people's heads. So now, where did all this derive from? I believe it derived from a fallacy of stolen concept. It started out, this whole notion of rights as sort of synthetic, social fabrications. It started out with Machiavelli, actually. Machiavelli changed the focus of political philosophy from the way people ought to be to the way they are, and then he basically sort of ignored the possibility of any sort of transcendent moral truths or anything like that. And so as a result, he basically just had, tried to derive a political philosophy based on no moral concepts at all. Well, the problem with this is that natural rights are based on natural law, which is, sort of a moral concept, right? So you have, he's taking the conclusion, which is rights, and then, actually, not he, I'm going to get into Hobbes, okay, this is Hobbes, actually. Hobbes started off Machiavelli and assumed everyone was sort of psychopathic at nature, and then that all rights were constructions of the state. The problem with this is that's not what rights are. They're derived from natural law, and so he tried to kind of steal rights from natural law theory and put them into his model, but then denying the natural rights basis. Hobbes is a natural continuation from Machiavelli. And so then after this we have, Hobbes is the first contract theorist, and then since then all contract theory derives from that point, and so from this we get this notion that rights are just contrived social constructs, and we can just make them up as we go along, and there are no, natural laws that go along with them. So I'm hoping this can clear up some idiotic thinking regarding rights. See y'all later.